When Colonel Raymond Pike asked his assembled marksmen who could handle the Barrett .50 caliber rifle, every hand shot up except one. Carmen Vega just smiled quietly, and in that silence, she said more than all their boasts combined. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if the story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Carmen Vega stepped out of her rusted Honda Civic in the parking lot of Camp Thunder Ridge, her worn canvas bag slung over her shoulder and a guitar case that had seen better days resting against her hip. The Utah desert heat hit her like a wall as she surveyed the sprawling military contractor facility carved into the red rock landscape. This wasn't supposed to be her life at 32. 6 months ago, she'd been Sergeant First Class Carmen Vega, leading reconnaissance missions in Afghanistan. Now, she was just another veteran trying to find her place in a world that seemed to have moved on without her. The job posting had been simple. Experienced marksman wanted for advanced weapons testing and training, military background preferred. What it didn't mention was that she'd be walking into a boys' club, where her DD 214 discharge papers meant less than the swagger you carried and the stories you could tell about your latest civilian shooting competitions. The other contractors moved with the kind of confidence that came from never having their abilities questioned. Their tactical gear was pristine, their rifles custom-built works of art worth more than Carmen's monthly rent. She watched them compare modifications and discuss ballistic coefficients with the casual expertise of people who'd never had to make a shot that actually mattered. Her own equipment felt suddenly inadequate. The guitar case held her grandfather's M1 Garand, the same rifle he'd carried through the Pacific Theater in World War II. It wasn't tactical, it wasn't modern, and it certainly didn't fit the image these contractors were projecting. But it had never let her down, and more importantly, she understood every inch of its mechanics. "Look what the VA dragged in," muttered Trevor Nash, a broad-shouldered former Marine whose voice carried across the staging area. His comment drew chuckles from the group of contractors clustered around a table covered in ammunition catalogs. "Hope she's not here for the marksmanship positions. This isn't a charity case operation." Trevor had made his reputation on the civilian competitive shooting circuit, winning matches with expensive equipment and sponsorship deals that funded his lifestyle. His rifle collection was worth more than most people's cars, and he made sure everyone knew it. To him, Carmen represented everything wrong with military hiring preferences, someone getting opportunities based on service rather than demonstrated civilian success. Carmen didn't respond to the jab. She had learned in the military that the loudest voices in the room were often compensating for something, and Trevor's need to announce his dominance suggested insecurity rather than confidence. Instead, she quietly found a spot at the edge of the group and pulled out a small notebook, its pages thick with hand-drawn range cards and environmental data she'd been collecting since her discharge. While the others boasted about their latest competition scores and equipment upgrades, Carmen studied the facility's layout. The wind patterns were complex here, with the desert thermals creating unpredictable currents between the red rock formations. Most of the contractors were focused on their gear, but Carmen was already calculating how the environment would affect long-range precision shooting. Master Sergeant Kim, the facility's lead instructor, barely acknowledged her during the initial briefing. When he reached her name on the roster, he paused with the kind of expression reserved for administrative errors. "Vega, Army discharge?" he asked, consulting his tablet with a frown.
"Yes, Sergeant Major. 6 years active duty, including 3 deployments," Carmen replied professionally. Kim looks her up and down, taking in her faded jeans, worn hiking boots, and the obvious age difference between her civilian clothes and everyone else's tactical gear. Her guitar case drew particular attention, and not the good kind. "Right," he said, his tone suggesting he was already writing her off. "We'll see what you can do." The facility briefing made the hierarchy clear immediately. This was a place where reputation mattered more than military service, where civilian competition scores carried more weight than combat experience. The walls were covered with photos of contractors at shooting competitions, their trophies and awards displayed like military commendations. Carmen noticed something the others missed. Not a single photo showed actual military service or combat deployments. These were weekend warriors who'd built careers on games rather than missions where lives hung in the balance. During the equipment inspection, Trevor made a point of stopping by Carmen's station. He lifted her guitar case with exaggerated curiosity, as if it might contain something dangerous. "What's in the case, sweetheart? Your lunch?" he asked, earning more laughter from his followers. "My rifle," Carmen replied, simply. "In a guitar case?" Trevor's eyebrows shot up in mock surprise. "What is it, some kind of vintage hunting rifle? This is a professional facility, not a gun show." Carmen opened the case, revealing the carefully maintained M1 Warand nestled in custom foam padding. The rifle was immaculate, every component cleaned and calibrated to perfection. But compared to the modern firearms surrounding it, it looked like a museum piece. "World War II surplus," Trevor announced to the group, his voice dripping with condescension. "Maybe the History Museum is hiring, but we're here for serious marksmanship work." The nickname started immediately. Museum Girl. By the end of the day, even some of the instructors were using it. Carmen endured it all in silence, focusing instead on learning the facility's procedures and preparing for whatever tests they'd throw at her. She had no way of knowing that Colonel Raymond Pike was arriving the next morning with a specific mission that would require exactly the kind of precision these contractors claimed to possess, or that the Barrett .50 caliber rifle, the most powerful sniper system in the military arsenal, would soon reveal the difference between range performance and real-world capability. But first, she had to survive being the misfit with the antique rifle that everyone had already dismissed as a relic from a bygone era. The woman they called Museum Girl was about to show them that sometimes the oldest tools in the box were the most reliable when everything depended on getting it right the first time.
The next morning brought Carmen's first real taste of how deep the contempt ran at Camp Thunder Ridge. She arrived early, as was her habit from military service, to find the range already occupied by Trevor Nash and his crew, conducting what they called morning PT, which consisted mainly of posturing with their expensive rifles and comparing their latest gear acquisitions. "Look who's here bright and early," Trevor announced as Carmen approached the equipment lockers. "Museum Girl probably needs extra time to wind up her antique rifle. Does it come with a hand crank, sweetheart?" The laughter that followed was more cutting than Carmen had expected. These weren't just casual jokes. There was genuine malice behind them, the kind of targeted harassment designed to drive someone away. Riley Park, another veteran contractor who'd been watching from a distance, shook his head but said nothing. He'd seen this pattern before. Carmen pulled her range bag from the locker and began methodically checking her equipment. While Trevor's group continued their performance, she quietly inspected every component of her rifle, checking the action, examining the barrel, and verifying her scope mounting. It was a ritual she'd performed thousands of times, first in basic training, then in countless combat zones where a malfunctioning weapon meant death. "You know what I heard?" said Jake Morrison, one of Trevor's regular followers, loud enough for the entire bay to hear. "I heard she only got this job because of some diversity quota. They needed a female veteran on the roster for the optics." The accusation stung because Carmen had heard variations of it throughout her military career and now in civilian life. Every achievement, every opportunity, every success was filtered through the assumption that she hadn't earned it on merit. The fact that her marksmanship scores had consistently been in the top 5% of her units seemed irrelevant when people had already decided she was there to fill a checkbox. Trevor leaned against his shooting bench, his custom precision rifle gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The weapon was a work of art, a $15,000 platform with every possible upgrade, from a match-grade barrel to a computer-assisted ballistic calculator mounted on the scope. It represented everything the modern shooting world valued: technology, expense, and the assumption that better equipment automatically produced better results. "Here's what I don't understand," Trevor continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone explaining something obvious to a child. "The military teaches you to spray and pray, right? Volume of fire, suppressive shooting, that kind of thing. But precision marksmanship is an art form. It requires finesse, patience, and equipment that can actually perform at the level we demand here." Carmen continued her preparation routine, but internally she was processing the fundamental misunderstanding Trevor had just revealed. Military marksmanship, especially at the level she operated in, was about precision under the worst possible conditions. Combat shooting required the ability to make accurate shots while exhausted, stressed, cold, hungry, and under enemy fire. Range shooting was a controlled environment where everything was predictable. Master Sergeant Kim approached the group as they were setting up for the day's qualification exercises. His attention immediately went to Trevor's setup, admiring the sophisticated rifle system and nodding approvingly at the precision ammunition Trevor was loading. "That's a beautiful piece of equipment," Kim said, examining Trevor's rifle. "Competition grade?" "Custom built by the same gunsmith who works for the Olympic team," replied Trevor, with obvious pride. "Sub-MOA accuracy guaranteed out to 1,000 yards. Cost me more than most people make in 3 months. But when you're serious about precision, you invest in the best." Kim's gaze shifted to Carmen's station, where her World War II-era rifle looked increasingly out of place among the modern equipment surrounding it. His expression was carefully neutral, but Carmen could read the skepticism in his eyes. "And you're planning to qualify with that?" Kim asked, gesturing toward the M1 Garand. "Yes, Sergeant Major," she replied simply. Kim consulted his tablet, scrolling through what appeared to be performance standards. "Our qualification course requires engagements out to 800 yards with sub-MOA accuracy. That's, challenging with vintage equipment."
The implication was clear. Carmen was setting herself up for failure, and Kim was giving her an opportunity to reconsider before she embarrassed herself publicly. Around them, other contractors had stopped their preparations to watch the exchange, sensing drama. Trevor seized the moment to drive his point home. "Kim, with all due respect, maybe we should have different standards for different situations. I mean, if someone wants to play EM pieces, that's fine, but this is supposed to be professional-level training." The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge. Create separate, lower standards for Carmen? Officially acknowledging that she wasn't expected to perform at the same level as the real marksman. It was the kind of condescending accommodation that would permanently brand her as second tier, regardless of her actual capabilities. Carmen felt the familiar calm settle over her, the same mental state she'd cultivated during her worst moments in Afghanistan. When everyone was watching, when the stakes were highest, when failure wasn't just personal embarrassment, but could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. "Same standards for everyone, Sergeant Major," she said, her voice steady and quiet. "I wouldn't want it any other way." Kim nodded slowly, but his expression suggested he was already writing her performance evaluation in his head. "Your choice, Vega. Range goes hot in 15 minutes. As Kim walked away, Trevor stepped closer to Carmen's position, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a helpful whisper, but was clearly intended for the others to hear. "Look, Carmen, can I call you Carmen? I'm not trying to be a dick here, but this isn't the Army. We don't get participation trophies, and we don't adjust standards for people who aren't quite ready for this level of competition. Maybe start with some of the basic marksmanship courses. Work your way up to the advanced stuff." The offer was wrapped in false concern, but Carmen recognized it for what it was, a final chance to back down gracefully before being humiliated in front of everyone. Trevor was giving her an out, confident that she'd take it rather than face the inevitable failure that would prove his assumptions correct. Carmen finished loading her rifle and closed the bolt with the distinctive ping that had echoed across battlefields for generations. The sound drew attention from every contractor on the range.
not because it was loud, but because it was so different from the quiet precision of modern bolt-action rifles. "I appreciate the advice," Carmen said, shouldering her rifle and moving toward the firing line, "but I think I'll stick with the original plan." Behind her, she heard Trevor's voice, no longer bothering to whisper, "Well, gentlemen, looks like we're about to get a front row seat to a train wreck. Anyone want to take bets on how badly this goes?" The laughter that followed wasn't cruel, it was worse. It was the kind of amused indifference reserved for watching someone make an obviously poor decision that would only hurt themselves. They weren't angry at Carmen or threatened by her presence. They simply didn't consider her a serious participant in what they were doing. As Carmen took her position on the firing line, she could feel dozens of eyes on her back, some curious, some amused, some already looking forward to the moment when she'd prove their assumptions correct and they could get back to the serious business of professional marksmanship. What none of them could see was the slight smile playing at the corners of Carmen's mouth as she settled into her shooting position. She'd been underestimated before, by enemies who'd paid dearly for their assumptions. The stakes here were lower, but the principle was the same. Sometimes the biggest advantage you could have was being dismissed by people who should have known better.
The qualification shoot was interrupted by the arrival of 3 black SUVs that swept through Camp Thunder Ridge's main gate with the kind of coordinated precision that immediately caught everyone's attention. The vehicles moved information toward the administration building, their tinted windows and government plates announcing the presence of someone important enough to warrant serious security. Carmen was in the middle of her second string of fire when Master Sergeant Kim's voice crackled over the range intercom. "Cease fire! Cease fire! All contractors report to the main briefing hall immediately. Secure your weapons and move with purpose." The sudden interruption sent ripples of speculation through the group of marksmen as they began clearing their rifles and securing their equipment. Trevor Nash, who had been in the middle of what he was calling a demonstration of proper technique for some of the newer contractors, looked genuinely annoyed at having his performance cut short. "Probably some bureaucrat from the Defense Department wanting to see how their money's being spent," Trevor muttered, but Carmen noticed he was moving faster than his casual tone suggested. Whatever was happening, it was significant enough to override the scheduled training. The briefing hall filled quickly with contractors, instructors, and facility staff. Carmen found herself toward the back of the room, still carrying the faint smell of gunpowder from the range. Around her, conversations buzzed with theories about who had arrived and what they wanted. The speculation ended when Colonel Raymond Pike entered the room. Pike was the kind of military officer who commanded attention without saying a word. Tall, lean, with graying hair that was cropped precisely, and eyes that seemed to catalog every person in the room within seconds. His uniform was immaculate, but more importantly, it carried the ribbon rack of someone who had earned his rank through combat leadership rather than staff assignments. Behind him walked Captain Diana Walsh, carrying a tablet and a briefcase that suggested whatever they were here for involved official documentation. Her expression was all business, the kind of focused intensity that indicated this wasn't a routine visit. "Gentlemen and ladies," Pike began, his voice carrying easily through the room without amplification. "I'm Colonel Raymond Pike, United States Army Special Operations Command. I'm here because we have a situation that requires immediate resolution, and Camp Thunder Ridge has been recommended as having the personnel to handle it." The room fell silent. This wasn't a bureaucratic inspection or a routine evaluation. This was an operational briefing, and the atmosphere shifted immediately from casual speculation to professional attention. Pike moved to the front of the room where a large map of mountainous terrain had been mounted on an easel. Red markers indicated specific locations, and Carmen recognized the topographical features of somewhere in the Middle East, though she couldn't identify the exact region from her position. 72 hours ago, a diplomatic convoy was ambushed in the Kandahar province. The attack was coordinated and professional. We have reason to believe the orchestrator, a high-value target we've been tracking for 18 months, is currently positioned in a compound approximately 1,200 meters from the nearest feasible observation post. The distance drew murmurs from the assembled contractors.
1,200 meters was at the extreme edge of what most precision rifles could handle effectively, and that was under ideal conditions. In combat, with environmental factors and the stress of actual engagement, it became exponentially more difficult. Pike gestured to the map indicating the specific challenges of the terrain. The target location is elevated, with limited approach routes and excellent fields of observation. Traditional assault methods would result in unacceptable casualties, and airstrikes are not an option due to the presence of civilian hostages. Carmen felt her pulse quicken. This was the kind of mission she had trained for during her military service, the precise, surgical operations where failure meant not just mission failure, but the loss of innocent lives. Around her, she could see the contractors processing the implications of what Pike was describing. The solution requires a single, precision shot from extreme range under combat conditions. Success depends on absolute accuracy, perfect environmental reading, and the ability to perform under pressure when lives hang in the balance.
Trevor Nash raised his hand, his expression confident. "Colonel, what's the specific weapon system for the engagement?" Pike's smile was thin and professional. "Barrett M107A1, 50 caliber, semi-automatic anti-material rifle. Effective range extends well beyond the 1,200 meters required, but the shot will need to be taken from an elevated position in mountainous terrain with unpredictable wind conditions." The Barrett 50 caliber rifle was legendary in military circles, but Carmen knew that reputation came with a price. The weapon was devastatingly powerful, but it was also brutally punishing to shoot accurately. The recoil was tremendous, the muzzle blast was disorienting, and the rifle's weight made precise positioning challenging even for experienced shooters. More importantly, the Barrett required a completely different shooting technique than the precision rifles most of these contractors were accustomed to. It wasn't a finesse weapon, it was a hammer that demanded respect, experience, and the physical strength to control it under pressure. Pike's gaze swept the room, taking in the faces of the assembled marksmen. "I need to know who among you has actual experience with the Barrett system under field conditions. Not range time, not familiarization firing. I need someone who has used this weapon in actual operations where lives depended on the outcome." The room fell silent. Carmen could see several contractors shifting uncomfortably, including Trevor, whose confidence had wavered slightly at the mention of field conditions. Range shooting with expensive precision rifles was one thing. Controlling a Barrett 50 caliber under combat stress was entirely different. "The mission launches in 6 hours. I need my shooter identified, briefed, and equipped within the next 2 hours. The window for this operation is narrow, and we won't get another chance." Captain Walsh stepped forward with her tablet. "We'll need to verify qualifications, review service records, and conduct a practical evaluation with the actual weapon system. Time is critical, but we cannot afford to select the wrong person for this mission." Pike's voice carried the weight of command authority as he asked the question that would change everything. "So I need to know right now, who among you can handle the Barrett 50 caliber under combat conditions?" Every hand in the room shot up immediately. Every hand except Carmen's. Trevor Nash was first to speak, his voice carrying the confidence that had served him well in civilian competitions. "Colonel, I've got extensive experience with long-range precision systems. My competition record speaks for itself. And I've been working with .50 caliber platforms for the past 3 years." Other contractors began voicing their qualifications, each trying to outdo the previous speaker with claims of experience and capability. The room filled with the competitive energy of men trying to prove they belonged in an elite category. Pike listened politely, but Carmen noticed his eyes kept returning to her position at the back of the room. She was the only person who hadn't raised her hand, the only contractor who wasn't volunteering for what was clearly the most important mission any of them would ever face. When the voices died down, Pike's attention focused directly on her. "Ms. Vega, you haven't volunteered. Any particular reason?" Carmen felt every eye in the room turn toward her. Trevor's expression was somewhere between amusement and annoyance, clearly irritated that someone he dismissed as incompetent was getting attention from the colonel. Carmen's response was quiet but clear enough for everyone to hear. "You asked who could handle the Barrett 50, sir.
That's not a question you answer by raising your hand. The silence that followed was complete. Pike's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes suggested he had just heard exactly what he'd been hoping to hear. And in that moment, Carmen Vega smiled. The same quiet, confident smile that would soon say everything that needed to be said about the difference between claiming you could do something and actually being able to do it when everything was on the line.
Colonel Pike's attention remained fixed on Carmen as the briefing room buzzed with confused whispers. Her response had clearly caught everyone off guard, including Trevor Nash, whose face showed a mixture of irritation and disbelief that the museum girl was getting serious consideration for the most important mission any of them had ever encountered. "Explain that statement, Ms. Vega," Pike said, his voice carrying the tone of someone accustomed to getting complete answers to his questions. Carmen moved slightly forward, her posture shifting into the respectful attention stance that had been drilled into her during 6 years of military service. "Sir, in my experience, the Barrett 50 isn't a weapon you volunteer for. It's a weapon that chooses you, usually when everything else has failed and you're the last option standing between mission success and catastrophic failure." The room remained silent, but Carmen could feel the skepticism radiating from the other contractors. Trevor's expression had shifted from irritation to outright disbelief, as if Carmen had just claimed she could fly. Pike nodded slowly. "And you have that experience?" "3 deployments, sir. Afghanistan, 2018 to 2021. I was attached to a joint task force conducting high-value target elimination missions in Helmand and Kandahar provinces." Carmen's voice remained steady, professional. "The Barrett was my primary weapon system for overwatch and long-range interdiction." Captain Walsh consulted her tablet, scrolling through what appeared to be service records. Records confirm Sergeant First Class Carmen Vega, Army Rangers, specialized marksmanship instructor qualified on multiple weapon systems, including the M107A1 Barrett. The revelation hit the room like a physical force. Carmen wasn't just another veteran looking for contractor work. She was a former Army Ranger with specialized combat experience on the exact weapon system Pike needed for his mission. Trevor's voice cut through the stunned silence, carrying a tone of desperate skepticism. "Hold on, Colonel. I mean, no disrespect to Ms. Vega's service, but combat experience doesn't automatically translate to precision shooting. The Barrett is a finesse weapon that requires—" "Have you ever fired a Barrett 50 under combat conditions, Mr. Nash?" Pike interrupted, his tone sharp enough to slice steel. Trevor's confident facade wavered. "Well, no, sir, but I have extensive experience with precision long-range platforms and the principles are the same regardless of caliber." Carmen almost smiled at that response. The Barrett 50 caliber wasn't just a scaled-up precision rifle. It was an entirely different beast that demanded respect, physical strength, and the mental fortitude to control a weapon that could literally knock an inexperienced shooter unconscious with its recoil. "The principles are not the same," Carmen said quietly, drawing Pike's attention back to her. "The Barrett isn't a precision instrument, it's a precision sledgehammer. The recoil will break ribs if you don't position correctly. The muzzle blast will disorient you if you're not prepared for it. And the weapon weighs 35 pounds loaded, which means your shooting position has to be perfect because you won't get a second chance to adjust." Master Sergeant Kim, who had been listening from the side of the room, stepped forward with obvious skepticism. "Ms. Vega, with all due respect, your qualification scores here have been adequate. But this mission requires exceptional performance under extreme pressure." Carmen turned to face Kim directly. "Sergeant Major, my qualification scores have been adequate because I've been shooting someone else's course of fire with artificial time limits that have nothing to do with real-world performance. You want to know if I can handle the Barrett 50? Give me the Barrett 50. The challenge hung in the air like electricity. Pike's expression remained neutral, but Carmen could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. He was weighing combat experience against range performance.
actual operational history against theoretical qualification scores. Trevor sensed the moment slipping away from him and made one last attempt to regain control of the narrative. Colonel, I understand the appeal of choosing someone with combat experience, but this mission is too important for sentiment. This requires the best marksman available, and my competition record speaks for itself.
Your competition record, Pike said slowly, involves shooting at paper targets under controlled conditions, with unlimited time and no consequences for failure beyond personal embarrassment. The words landed like physical blows. Pike continued, his voice taking on the edge that Carmen recognized from military leaders who had run out of patience with posturing. This mission involves shooting at a human target at extreme range under combat conditions where wind, temperature, elevation, and enemy fire will all affect the shot. The target will be moving, the conditions will be unpredictable, and failure means innocent people die while the high-value target escapes to plan more attacks. Captain Walsh stepped forward with her tablet. Colonel, we could conduct a practical evaluation with both candidates, set up a test scenario with the actual Barrett system, and see who performs better under simulated combat conditions. Pike considered this for a moment, then nodded. Fair enough. Both Miss Vega and Mr. Nash will have the opportunity to demonstrate their capabilities with the Barrett 50. However, given our time constraints, this will be a single-shot evaluation. One chance, one target, conditions as close to the actual mission parameters as we can simulate. Trevor's confidence returned immediately. This was familiar territory, a shooting competition with clear rules and measurable results. Thank you, Colonel. I appreciate the opportunity to demonstrate my capabilities. Carmen said nothing, but Pike noticed her lack of response. Miss Vega, any concerns about the evaluation format? No, sir, Carmen replied, but I'd like to inspect the weapon and ammunition beforehand. The Barrett is sensitive to ammunition quality, and I want to verify the scope mounting in zero before the evaluation. It was a professional request that demonstrated exactly the kind of attention to detail Pike was looking for. Trevor, meanwhile, was already discussing strategy with some of his followers, confident that his superior equipment and competition experience would carry the day. Master Sergeant Kim approached Carmen as the briefing broke up. Vega, I have to ask, why didn't you mention your ranger background during your initial evaluation here? That's significant qualification information. Carmen shouldered her range bag, the same worn canvas bag that had drawn mockery when she'd first arrived. Sergeant Major, in my experience, people who need to announce their qualifications usually don't have any. I figured my shooting would speak for itself. Kim studied her for a moment, perhaps seeing her clearly for the first time since she'd arrived at Camp Thunder Ridge. That Barrett evaluation is in 2 hours. The weapon will be available for inspection in 30 minutes. As Carmen walked toward the armory to prepare, she could hear Trevor's voice behind her addressing his usual audience of followers. This is actually perfect. When I outshoot the supposed combat veteran, it'll prove once and for all that real precision shooting is about skill and preparation, not military fairy tales. The laughter that followed was nervous rather than confident. Something had shifted in the room's dynamic, and even Trevor's most loyal supporters seemed to sense that the evaluation might not go as predictably as they had assumed. Carmen reached the armory and began methodically preparing her gear. She had 2 hours to inspect an unfamiliar Barrett rifle, verify at zero, and prepare for a shot that would either validate everything she'd learned in combat or confirm every assumption her critics had made about her abilities. But as she began cleaning her grandfather's M1 Garand and returning it to its guitar case, Carmen felt the familiar calm settling over her mind. This wasn't about proving anything to Trevor Nash or Master Sergeant Kim, or even Colonel Pike. This was about doing the job that needed to be done with the tools available under whatever conditions existed. Everything else was just noise.
The Barrett M1007A1 lay on the armory workbench like a sleeping giant, its massive frame demanding respect even in stillness.
Carmen approached the weapon with the careful reverence of someone who understood exactly what she was looking at. Not just a rifle, but a precisely engineered system capable of delivering devastating accuracy at distances that pushed the boundaries of what most people considered possible. 35 pounds of steel, aluminum, and polymer, stretching nearly 5 feet in length. The Barrett wasn't built for comfort or convenience. It was built to reach out and touch targets at ranges where other weapons became ineffective. Carmen ran her hands along the barrel, checking for any signs of damage or wear, then began the methodical inspection process she'd learned during her ranger training. Trevor Nash entered the armory 15 minutes later, accompanied by his usual entourage of supporters. His confidence had returned during the break, bolstered by conversations with contractors who'd assured him that combat experience couldn't compensate for superior technical knowledge and competitive shooting skills. "Impressive piece of hardware," Trevor said, approaching the Barrett with the casual familiarity of someone who'd handled similar weapons in controlled environments. "I've worked with the civilian version extensively, same basic platform, just with some military-specific modifications." Carmen continued her inspection without looking up. She was examining the scope mounting system, checking for any looseness or misalignment that could throw off the shot. The Barrett scope was a military-grade day optic capable of precise ranging and ballistic compensation, but it was only as good as its mounting system. "You know," Trevor continued, his voice taking on the instructional tone he used when explaining things to people he considered less experienced, "the key to success with the Barrett is understanding the ballistics. The .50 caliber round has a very specific trajectory profile, and you need to account for the increased bullet drop over extended ranges." Carmen finally looked up from the weapon. "What's the muzzle velocity on the M33 ball ammunition we'll be using?" Trevor paused, clearly not expecting a technical question. "Well, approximately 2,800 feet per second, depending on environmental conditions." "And the ballistic coefficient?" Another pause. "I'd have to check the specifications, but it's in the standard range for .50 caliber projectiles." Carmen nodded and returned to her inspection. She had been testing Trevor's knowledge, and his responses told her everything she needed to know. He had general information about the Barrett system, but he lacked the specific, detailed understanding that came from extensive field use under varying conditions. Master Sergeant Kim entered the armory carrying a clipboard and looking distinctly uncomfortable with the situation. Having two contractors compete for a real-world mission wasn't standard protocol, and Kim was clearly struggling with how to structure an evaluation that would provide Colonel Pike with the information he needed. "All right, here's how this works. We've set up a target at 800 yards to simulate the mission distance of 1,200 meters, adjusted for elevation and atmospheric conditions here versus the operational environment. Each shooter gets 3 rounds to zero the rifle, then 1 shot for evaluation." Carmen looked up from the Barrett. "Sergeant Major, who zeroed this rifle last and when?" Kim consulted his clipboard. "The weapon was zeroed 2 weeks ago during routine maintenance. It should be close to accurate." "Should be isn't good enough for a mission-critical shot. I'd like to verify the zero myself before the evaluation." Tremor rolled his eyes. "Carmen, we're talking about an 800-yard shot with a military precision weapon system. The rifle is fine. What matters is the shooter's ability to read conditions and execute properly." The comment revealed another gap in Trevor's understanding. In competitive shooting, rifles were carefully maintained and regularly verified by professional gunsmiths. In military operations, weapons were maintained by whoever was available, often under field conditions, and their accuracy could shift due to transportation, temperature changes, or simple mechanical wear. Kim looked between the two shooters, clearly trying to balance fairness with time constraints. "Miss Vega, you'll have the same 3 zeroing rounds as Mr. Nash. Use them however you think best." Carmen nodded and began loading the Barrett's 10-round magazine with the match-grade ammunition that had been provided for the evaluation. Each .5 caliber cartridge was nearly as long as her index finger, the massive projectiles designed to maintain accuracy and devastating power across extreme distances. The weapon's weight became apparent when Carmen lifted it from the workbench. 35 pounds didn't sound overwhelming until you tried to maneuver it into a precise shooting position while maintaining the stability necessary for long-range accuracy.
She settled the rifle onto the shooting rest, adjusting the bipod legs for proper height and cant. Through the scope, the 800-yard target looked deceptively close. The military-grade optic magnified the target clearly, but Carmen knew that the apparent proximity was misleading. At that distance, a slight error in wind reading or trigger control could result in a complete miss, and environmental factors that were negligible at shorter ranges became critical variables. Trevor took his position at the adjacent shooting station, his movements confident and practiced. His competitive shooting background was evident in the smoothness of his setup routine. Bipod deployment, scope adjustment, ammunition preparation, everything was textbook perfect. The kind of systematic approach that one matches on civilian ranges. "Shooters," Kim announced, "you may commence zeroing when ready. Remember, 3 rounds each, then 1 shot for evaluation." Trevor fired first, his shot echoing across the range with the distinctive crack boom of the Barrett's report. The massive muzzle brake directed the blast sideways, creating a pressure wave that Carmen could feel even from her position 15 feet away. Through her spotting scope, Carmen watched Trevor's bullet impact 6 inches low and 3 inches right of the target's center. A respectable shot that would have been considered excellent with most rifle systems, but the Barrett demanded better precision. Trevor's second shot moved closer to center, and his third was within 2 inches of the bullseye. His technique was solid, his confidence obvious, and his grouping demonstrated the kind of consistency that came from extensive practice. Carmen's turn. She settled behind the Barrett, feeling the familiar weight of the buttstock against her shoulder. The rifle's balance was different from what most people expected. Heavier in the barrel, with a center of gravity that required specific positioning to control effectively. Her first shot surprised everyone, including herself. Dead center bullseye, with the kind of precision that suggested either exceptional skill or remarkable luck. The impact was clean and definitive, exactly what a perfect Barrett shot should look like. Trevor's confidence wavered slightly. "Lucky shot," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Carmen's second shot impacted less than an inch from her first, creating what amounted to a single, enlarged hole in the target's center. The grouping was tighter than what most precision shooters could achieve with smaller caliber weapons at shorter distances. Her third shot completed a group that could be covered by a quarter. 3 shots, 800 yards, with a weapon she'd never fired before, producing accuracy that bordered on the impossible. The range fell silent except for the echo of the last shot fading across the desert landscape. Trevor stared at the target through his spotting scope, his face showing a mixture of disbelief and dawning recognition that everything he'd assumed about this evaluation was wrong. Kim lowered his binoculars, his expression troubled. "Ms. Vega, that's exceptional shooting. Possibly the best I've seen with the Barrett system." Carmen began clearing the rifle, her movements automatic and precise. "The weapon is well maintained, Sergeant Major. Good ammunition, stable conditions, proper rest. The Barrett will do what it's designed to do if you let it." Colonel Pike's voice came from behind them. "I've been watching from the observation post. Ms. Vega, that was remarkable marksmanship, but we haven't completed the evaluation yet." Carmen turned to face Pike, her expression calm but attentive. "Sir?" "The evaluation shot. Both shooters get 1 round fired under simulated combat conditions, time pressure, environmental challenges, and consequences for failure." Pike gestured toward Captain Walsh, who was approaching with what appeared to be additional equipment. "The mission scenario requires more than just accuracy. It requires the ability to perform under pressure when everything is going wrong and lives depend on the outcome." Carmen felt the familiar calm settling over her mind, the same mental state that had carried her through dozens of high-stakes situations in Afghanistan. This wasn't about competition or proving a point anymore. This was about doing the job, whatever it took, when failure wasn't an option.
Captain Walsh approached with a tactical radio and what appeared to be a modified shooting timer system. The equipment looked military-grade, designed for training scenarios that replicated the chaos and pressure of actual combat operations, rather than the controlled environment of competitive shooting. "The scenario is simple," Colonel Pike announced to the assembled group. "Intelligence indicates the target will be visible for exactly 90 seconds during a scheduled patrol of the compound's perimeter. Environmental conditions will be challenging, wind gusts up to 15 miles per hour, temperature differential between firing position and target area, and potential interference from dust and heat shimmer." Carmen felt her pulse slow as her mind automatically began calculating the variables Pike was describing. Wind at 15 miles per hour would push a .5 caliber projectile several inches off course at 800 yards. Temperature differential would affect both bullet velocity and scope tracking. Heat shimmer would create optical distortions that could make precise target identification difficult. Pike continued his briefing, his voice carrying the weight of operational experience. "Additionally, the shooting position will be compromised. Intelligence suggests enemy counter-sniper teams in the area, which means the shooter will be under potential observation and return fire from the moment of engagement." Captain Walsh activated the tactical radio, and suddenly the range was filled with the sounds of simulated combat. Distant explosions, radio chatter, and the intermittent crack of small arms fire. The audio was loud enough to be distracting but not overwhelming, creating the kind of sensory environment that could break concentration if a shooter wasn't prepared for it. "Mr. Nash," Pike said, "you're first. You have 90 seconds from the moment the target appears to identify, range, and engage. One shot, one opportunity. Miss, and innocent lives are lost while the high-value target escapes." Trevor's confidence had returned during Pike's briefing. This was familiar territory, a timed shooting scenario with specific parameters and clear success criteria. He settled behind the Barrett with practiced movements, adjusting the bipod and settling into his shooting position with the smooth efficiency of someone who'd done this hundreds of times in competition. The target system activated with a mechanical whir, and a silhouette appeared at 800 yards. Not the clean geometric shape of a typical shooting target, but a realistic human figure that moved slightly, simulating the natural movement of a person walking along a predetermined path. Trevor's technique was textbook perfect. He acquired the target quickly, worked the Barrett's bolt with smooth precision, and began his breathing sequence. Through her spotting scope, Carmen could see his crosshairs tracking the target's movement, leading appropriately for the simulated walking speed. The combat audio increased in intensity, with radio chatter becoming more urgent and the sound of incoming fire growing closer. It was designed to create stress and distraction, to test whether a shooter could maintain focus when everything around them suggested immediate danger. Trevor's shot came at the 60-second mark, well within the time limit. The Barrett's report echoed across the range, followed by the distinctive whistle of the massive projectile cutting through the air. Through the spotting scope, Carmen watched the bullet impact, a solid hit, center mass, exactly what the mission parameters required. "Good shot," Pike acknowledged, his tone professional but not enthusiastic. "Clean hit, well within acceptable parameters." Trevor climbed out from behind the Barrett, his expression confident and satisfied. "Thank you, Colonel. That's what happens when you combine proper technique with quality equipment." The comment was clearly directed at Carmen, a reminder that his success came from superior preparation and competitive experience rather than luck or accident. Several of the watching contractors nodded approvingly, their faith in Trevor's abilities apparently confirmed by his performance. "Ms. Vega, your turn." Carmen approached the Barrett with movements that were notably different from Trevor's competition-polished routine. Where Trevor had been smooth and systematic, Carmen was economical and purposeful. Every action served a specific function, with no wasted motion or unnecessary adjustments. She settled behind the rifle and immediately began making small modifications to Trevor's setup. The bipod legs were adjusted for a slightly different cant angle, accounting for the natural slope of the shooting position. The buttstock was repositioned to better distribute the Barrett's massive recoil. Most significantly, she moved the rifle's position 3 inches to the left, changing the sight picture in a way that wasn't obvious to the observers. Interesting adjustments, Master Sergeant Kim observed. Any particular reason for the position changes? Carmen didn't look up from the rifle. Mr. Nash set up for a right-handed shooter firing from level ground in still air. I'm adjusting for actual conditions. The comment drew skeptical looks from several observers, including Trevor. The adjustments Carmen had made seemed minor, the kind of fine-tuning that might matter in precision competition, but shouldn't be necessary for a center-mass shot at 800 yards. Pike activated the target system, and the silhouette appeared. But this time, the scenario was different. Instead of the steady walking pattern Trevor had faced, the target moved erratically, stopping and starting in an unpredictable sequence that simulated someone who suspected they were under observation. The combat audio was also more intense, with the sound of incoming artillery and urgent radio traffic about enemy movement in the area. The stress level was deliberately higher, designed to test whether Carmen could maintain focus when the situation was deteriorating rapidly around her. Carmen's approach was immediately different from Trevor's. Instead of rushing to acquire the target, she spent the first 15 seconds studying the wind flags and environmental conditions through her scope. She was reading the terrain, calculating how heat shimmer would affect target acquisition, and determining how wind patterns would influence bullet trajectory. At the 30-second mark, she still hadn't fired. Several observers began shifting nervously, wondering if she was struggling with the time pressure or freezing under the simulated combat conditions. At 45 seconds, the target stopped moving, presenting a stationary silhouette for what appeared to be a perfect shooting opportunity. Trevor would have taken that shot immediately, capitalizing on the stable target presentation. Carmen didn't fire. At 60 seconds, Pike began to look concerned. Half the available time had passed, and Carmen hadn't even appeared to begin her shooting sequence. The target resumed movement, following an irregular pattern that would make engagement significantly more difficult. At 75 seconds, with only 15 seconds remaining in the scenario, Carmen finally began her breathing sequence. Her crosshairs settled on the target, tracking its movement with the kind of smooth precision that suggested complete familiarity with the Barrett's handling characteristics. At 85 seconds, with only 5 seconds left in the scenario, Carmen fired. The Barrett's massive report seemed louder than Trevor's shot had been, the muzzle blast creating a visible pressure wave that kicked up dust 15 feet in all directions. The recoil drove the heavy rifle back against Carmen's shoulder, but her position absorbed the impact without movement or loss of control. Through the spotting scope, the bullet's impact was immediately visible. Not just a hit, but a perfect center mass strike that would have been instantly fatal in a real engagement. The shot placement was so precise it looked almost deliberate, as if Carmen had been aiming for that exact spot rather than simply trying to hit the target.
But more importantly, the timing of the shot corresponded exactly with a momentary lull in the simulated wind conditions. Carmen hadn't been hesitating or struggling with time pressure. She'd been waiting for the optimal moment when environmental conditions would allow for a perfect shot. The range fell silent except for the fading echo of the Barrett's report. Pike stared at the target through his binoculars, his expression shifting from concern to something approaching amazement. "Ms. Vega," he said slowly, "explain your shooting sequence. Why did you wait so long to engage?" Carmen began clearing the Barrett, her movements automatic and efficient. "Sir, the target was presenting deceptive opportunities throughout the scenario. The early shot window looked good, but the wind conditions were wrong. The second opportunity had better wind, but the target was moving in a pattern that suggested awareness of surveillance." She paused to check that the rifle was completely clear before continuing. At the 75-second mark, the wind died to under 3 miles per hour, and the target's movement pattern indicated distraction rather than tactical awareness. That was the right shot window. Pike lowered his binoculars, his gaze moving between Carmen and the perfect shot she just delivered under what everyone had assumed were the most challenging conditions possible. "You waited for perfect conditions instead of taking the first acceptable opportunity." "Yes, sir. In the real world, you don't get do-overs. Better to wait for the right shot than take the fast shot." Trevor's voice cut through the silence, carrying a note of desperation that hadn't been there before. "Colonel, both shots were successful. The mission parameters were met in both cases."
Pike nodded slowly, but his attention remained focused on Carmen. Mr. Nash is correct. Both shots would have accomplished the mission objective. However, there's a significant difference between adequate performance and optimal performance when lives are at stake. He turned to address both shooters directly. This mission requires more than just the ability to hit a target at long range. It requires the judgment to recognize the right moment, the patience to wait for optimal conditions, and the skill to deliver a perfect shot when everything depends on getting it right the first time. Pike's decision was clear in his voice before he announced it. Ms. Vega, you're my shooter for this operation. Report for mission briefing in 1 hour. The silence that followed was complete and absolute. Carmen had not only proven her capabilities with the Barrett system, she demonstrated the kind of tactical judgment and environmental awareness that couldn't be taught in any civilian competition or replicated on any range. Trevor stared at the target, his confident facade finally cracking, as he realized that everything he'd assumed about precision shooting, about military experience, and about Carmen Vega had been completely wrong. Carmen shouldered her range bag and began walking toward the armory, her movements calm and purposeful. Behind her, she could hear whispered conversations as the gathered contractors tried to process what they'd just witnessed. The woman they'd called Museum Girl had just delivered the most perfect shot any of them had ever seen, under conditions that would have challenged the world's best marksmen. And she'd done it with the quiet confidence of someone who understood that real precision shooting wasn't about impressing observers or winning competitions. It was about being ready when everything mattered most.
The armory fell silent as Carmen entered to secure the Barrett rifle. Behind her, the sound of heated discussions drifted through the open door. Contractors, instructors, and facility staff trying to process what they'd just witnessed. The woman they'd dismissed as Museum Girl had not only outshot their golden boy Trevor Nash, but had demonstrated a level of tactical sophistication that redefined everything they thought they knew about precision marksmanship. Master Sergeant Kim appeared in the doorway, his expression a mixture of confusion and something that might have been embarrassment. For weeks, he'd watched Carmen work quietly in the background, accepting the mockery and dismissal without complaint, never once suggesting that his evaluation of her capabilities might have been fundamentally flawed. "Ms. Vega," Kim said, his voice carefully controlled, "I need to ask you something, and I want a straight answer. During your initial evaluation here, you performed adequately, but not exceptionally. What we just saw on that range was something else entirely. Can you explain the difference?" Carmen continued her methodical cleaning of the Barrett, running patches through the massive bore with the same attention to detail she'd applied to every weapon that had passed through her hands. "Sergeant Major, you tested my ability to shoot fast under artificial time constraints. Colonel Pike tested my ability to shoot right under combat conditions. Those are completely different skill sets." The answer was delivered without criticism or defensiveness, but it highlighted the fundamental flaw in how Camp Thunder Ridge had been evaluating marksmanship. Kim had been measuring speed and consistency under controlled conditions, while real-world precision shooting required judgment, patience, and the ability to perform under genuine pressure. Riley Park, the veteran contractor who'd been watching Carmen's treatment with growing discomfort, stepped into the armory. "Carmen, I owe you an apology. I should have spoken up weeks ago when I saw how you were being treated here." Carmen looked up from the Barrett. "Riley, you don't owe me anything. Everyone makes their own choices about what they're willing to tolerate and what they're willing to challenge." It wasn't quite forgiveness, but it wasn't condemnation either. Carmen had spent her military career learning that institutional change happened slowly and that individual allies were rare and precious. Riley's silence during her worst treatment hadn't been malicious. It had been the passive acceptance that allowed toxic cultures to persist. Colonel Pike entered the armory, carrying a secure briefcase and a tablet loaded with mission-specific information. His presence immediately shifted the atmosphere from personal reflection to operational focus.
This was no longer about settling scores or making points. Lives hung in the balance, and Pike needed his chosen marksman ready for deployment. "Ms. Vega, we need to discuss mission specifics," Pike said, setting his briefcase on the workbench. "The operational environment presents challenges that didn't come up during the evaluation." Carmen secured the Barrett in its case and gave Pike her full attention. This was familiar territory, the transition from training to operations, where theoretical knowledge met real-world complexity and lives depended on getting every detail right. Pike opened the briefcase, revealing detailed topographical maps, satellite imagery, and target identification photographs. The compound is located in mountainous terrain at an elevation of 8,200 feet. The shooting position will be at 9,400 feet, which means significant altitude effects on ballistics. Carmen studied the imagery, her mind automatically calculating the challenges Pike was describing. Altitude affected air density, which changed bullet trajectory. Temperature differential between firing position and target area would create complex wind patterns. Most critically, the thin air at high altitude would affect both bullet performance and the shooter's physical capabilities. "Sir, what's the timeline for deployment?" Carmen asked, studying the satellite photos more closely. "Wheels up in 4 hours. Flight time to staging area is 6 hours, then a 2-hour helicopter insertion to the observation post. The target window opens 18 hours from now and remains open for approximately 4 hours." The compressed timeline was challenging, but manageable. Carmen had deployed on shorter notice during her military service, though never for a mission where success depended entirely on her individual performance. Usually, precision shooting was part of a larger operation with multiple backup plans and contingencies. Captain Walsh joined the briefing, carrying additional intelligence materials and communication equipment. "Ms. Vega, you'll be operating with a 2-man support team, a spotter and a communications specialist. They're both experienced special operations personnel, but they haven't worked with you before."
Carmen nodded. Spotter-shooter relationships were critical for long-range precision work, especially under combat conditions. The spotter handled environmental calculations, target identification, and security, while the shooter focused entirely on the weapon system. Effective teams developed an almost telepathic understanding of each other's roles and capabilities. "Sir, I'd like to review the ballistic data for the specific ammunition we'll be using, and I need to verify the rifle's zero at altitude before the mission," Carmen said. "The Barrett I just fired was zeroed at this elevation with standard density air. The operational environment will change the bullet's trajectory significantly." Pike's expression showed approval. These were exactly the kinds of details that separated competent marksmen from exceptional ones. Trevor Nash's competitive background had given him technical knowledge, but Carmen's combat experience taught her to think systemically about every variable that could affect mission success. "The staging area has a range facility where you can verify zero and conduct final preparation," Pike confirmed. "You'll have access to the actual ammunition load we'll be carrying, and the support team will be available for coordination exercises." Master Sergeant Kim approached the group, clearly struggling with how to address the situation. "Colonel, I feel I should mention that Ms. Vega's performance during the evaluation exceeded anything we've seen from contractors at this facility. Her tactical decision-making was exceptional." The admission was clearly difficult for Kim. He'd built his reputation on identifying and developing precision marksmen, and his initial dismissal of Carmen represented a significant failure of professional judgment. More troubling, her success raised questions about whether the facility's entire evaluation methodology was missing critical elements of real-world performance. Pike studied Kim for a moment. "Sergeant Major, what's your assessment of the other contractors here? If we needed a backup shooter for this mission, who would you recommend?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Kim's gaze moved involuntarily toward the door where Trevor Nash and his supporters were undoubtedly discussing Carmen's unexpected success. Everyone in the facility knew that Trevor was considered the premier marksman, the standard by which other shooters were measured. "Sir, based on today's evaluation, I'm not sure any of our other contractors could handle this mission," Kim admitted. "Ms. Vega demonstrated capabilities that we haven't seen before." The confession was devastating in its implications. Camp Thunder Ridge had been operating under the assumption that their top performers were ready for real-world precision shooting missions. Carmen's performance suggested that assumption was dangerously wrong. Carmen finished packing her gear, her movements efficient and purposeful. "Colonel, I'm ready for deployment. Just need to grab my personal kit and review the mission timeline." As she prepared to leave the armory, Trevor Nash appeared in the doorway. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by something that might have been humility, though it was hard to tell whether his change of attitude was genuine or strategic. "Carmen," Trevor said, his voice lacking its usual condescending tone, "that shot you made, I've never seen anything like it. The way you read the conditions, the timing, it was incredible." Carmen stopped packing and looked him directly. "Trevor, you're a good shooter. Your technique is solid, your equipment knowledge is extensive, and your competitive record speaks for itself. But competitive shooting and combat shooting are different disciplines. They require different mindsets, different priorities, different definitions of success." It wasn't the dismissive response Trevor might have expected. Instead, Carmen was offering him something more valuable than criticism. She was giving him insight into why his approach had fallen short and what he might need to learn to bridge the gap between range performance and real-world capability. "Maybe when you get back from this mission, you could help me understand those differences. I think I have a lot to learn." Carmen shouldered her kit bag and headed for the door. "Maybe, but first, let's see if I can bring everyone home safe." As she walked across the facility toward the deployment staging area, Carmen reflected on how dramatically her situation had changed in the space of a few hours. This morning, she'd been museum girl, the washed-out veteran with the antique rifle. Now she was the mission-critical asset that a colonel had hand-selected for a high-stakes operation where failure meant innocent lives lost and a high-value target escaping. But more than personal vindication, Carmen felt the weight of responsibility that came with being chosen for something that mattered. This wasn't about proving herself anymore. This was about using everything she'd learned, everything she'd trained for, everything she'd survived to make sure the mission succeeded and everyone came home safe. The real test was just beginning. The deployment staging area at Camp Thunder Ridge had been transformed into a miniature command center with communication equipment, mission maps, and tactical gears spread across multiple tables. Carmen entered to find herself at the center of an operation that involved far more personnel and resources than she'd initially realized. This wasn't just a single-shot mission. It was a complex, multi-phase operation where her role as the precision marksman was critical but not isolated. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb, her assigned spotter, stood up as she approached. He was a compact, weathered man in his early 30s whose eyes held the kind of alertness that came from years of high-stakes operations. Unlike the contractors at Camp Thunder Ridge, Webb carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd earned his reputation through successful missions rather than range scores. "Ma'am, I'm Webb, your spotter for this operation," he said, extending his hand with genuine respect. "I've been briefed on your background. Army Rangers, 3 deployments, specialized in long-range precision work. Looking forward to working with you." The difference in tone was immediately apparent. Webb wasn't questioning her qualifications or expressing surprise at her selection. He was treating her as a peer professional whose capabilities were already established. After weeks of dismissal and mockery, the simple acknowledgement of her competence felt almost foreign. Corporal Diana Hayes, the communications specialist, looked up from her equipment setup. "Miss Vega, I've established secure communications with the Operational Command Center. We'll have real-time intelligence updates throughout the mission, including weather data and target movement patterns." Carmen reviewed the communication protocols, noting the level of support infrastructure that had been assembled for the operation. This was special operations methodology, multiple layers of backup, redundant systems, and careful attention to every detail that could affect mission success. Colonel Pike approached with Captain Walsh and a man Carmen didn't recognize, a tall, lean officer wearing the ignition of a lieutenant colonel with Special Forces tabs. His presence suggested the mission's importance extended well beyond what Pike had initially described. "Miss Vega, this is Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, Special Operations Command.
He'll be coordinating the overall operation from the command center. Morrison studied Carmen with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to evaluating personnel under pressure. Miss Vega, I've reviewed your service record and the evaluation footage from this afternoon. Your performance was exceptional, but I need to understand something about your approach. Carmen gave Morrison her full attention. Senior Special Operations officers didn't ask casual questions. Everything they wanted to know was connected to mission success and personnel safety. During the evaluation, you waited until the last 15 seconds to take your shot. In a real combat environment, that kind of timing leaves no margin for error. What happens if the optimal conditions you are waiting for don't materialize? It was an astute question that got to the heart of tactical decision-making. Carmen had demonstrated her ability to recognize and exploit perfect conditions, but combat rarely provided perfect conditions. Sometimes you had to take the shot that was available rather than the shot you wanted. Sir, every tactical situation requires risk assessment. During the evaluation, I had enough information about environmental patterns to predict when conditions would improve. In a real mission, if the perfect shot window doesn't appear, you take the best shot available within the time constraints. Morrison nodded. And how do you make that distinction in the moment? What tells you when to wait versus when to engage with suboptimal conditions? Carmen considered the question carefully. It was the kind of decision-making that couldn't be reduced to simple rules or procedures. It required judgment that came from experience, training, and an intuitive understanding of how all the variables interacted under pressure. Sir, it comes down to consequences versus probability. If waiting increases the probability of mission success significantly and the consequences of delay are manageable, you wait. If delay creates unacceptable risks to personnel or mission objectives, you engage with whatever conditions exist. Morrison's expression showed approval. These were exactly the kinds of calculations that separated competent marksmen from exceptional ones, and Carmen's answer demonstrated the tactical sophistication necessary for complex operations. Meanwhile, word of Carmen's selection for the mission had spread throughout Camp Thunder Ridge. The facility's social dynamics had shifted dramatically in the hours since her Barrett demonstration. Contractors who'd been dismissive or openly hostile were now approaching her with a mixture of curiosity and newfound respect.
Jake Morrison, one of Trevor's regular supporters, appeared at the staging area with obvious discomfort. Miss Vega, I wanted to apologize for some of the things I said earlier. I didn't understand your background or capabilities. Carmen looked up from the mission materials she'd been studying. Jake, apologies aren't necessary. People make judgments based on the information they have available. What matters is being willing to update those judgments when new information becomes available. It was a gracious response that acknowledged his attempt to make amends without absolving him of responsibility for his earlier behavior. Carmen understood that changing institutional culture required both individual accountability and the opportunity for people to demonstrate growth. Riley Park entered the staging area carrying Carmen's personal gear, which he'd retrieved from the contractor quarters. Carmen, I brought your kit, and I wanted you to know what happened today is going to change things here. People are asking questions about how we evaluate talent and what we're actually preparing shooters for. The institutional implications were significant. Carmen's success had revealed fundamental flaws in Camp Thunder Ridge's approach to marksmanship training. The facility had been optimizing for range performance rather than tactical effectiveness, and the gap between those two standards had been exposed in a way that couldn't be ignored. Master Sergeant Kim appeared with a clipboard and an expression that suggested serious reflection about his role in perpetuating the facility's problems. Miss Vega, when you return from this mission, I'd like to discuss some changes to our evaluation protocols. Your approach to precision shooting, the environmental awareness, the tactical decision-making, those are elements we haven't been emphasizing adequately. Carmen finished loading her personal equipment into the deployment bag. Sergeant Major, the problem isn't with individual evaluation methods.
The problem is with the assumption that competitive shooting skills automatically translate to combat effectiveness. They're related but distinct skill sets. Kim nodded slowly. So, what would you recommend? How do we better prepare contractors for real-world missions? Start with understanding the difference between shooting fast and shooting right. Competitive shooting rewards speed and consistency under controlled conditions. Combat shooting requires adaptability, judgment, and the ability to perform under genuine stress. You can teach technical skills, but tactical judgment comes from experience with consequences. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the helicopter crew that would transport Carmen's team to the operational staging area. The pilot, a warrant officer with the weathered appearance of someone who'd flown countless high-risk missions, approached Colonel Pike for the final briefing. "Colonel, weather at the insertion point is marginal but acceptable. We have a 4-hour window before conditions deteriorate. If we're going to do this, we need to move now." Pike turned to Carmen. "Final question, Miss Vega. Are you ready for this mission?" Carmen shouldered her equipment bag and picked up the Barrett case. Around her, the staging area buzzed with the controlled energy of a military operation moving into execution phase. This was familiar territory, the transition from preparation to action, where training met reality, and everything learned in simulation was tested under genuine stakes. "Yes, sir. I'm ready." As Carmen walked toward the helicopter, she passed Trevor Nash, who was standing with several other contractors watching the deployment preparations. Their conversation stopped as she approached, and for a moment there was awkward silence. "Carmen," Trevor said, his voice lacking any trace of his earlier condescension. "Good luck out there. Bring everyone home safe." It was the first time he'd used her real name rather than the dismissive museum girl nickname. The change in his tone and word choice reflected a fundamental shift in how she was being perceived, not as an inadequate contractor who had stumbled into an opportunity, but as a professional whose capabilities had been proven under the most demanding conditions possible. Carmen nodded to the group. "Thank you. When I get back, maybe we can work on bridging the gap between range skills and tactical applications." As the helicopter engines spun up and the operational team made final preparations for insertion, Carmen reflected on how completely her situation had changed. 12 hours ago, she was an outcast with an antique rifle. Now, she was the mission-critical element in a special operations deployment where lives hung in the balance. But more than personal vindication, Carmen felt the weight of responsibility that came with being trusted with something that mattered. The real test wasn't behind her, it was waiting at 9,400 feet in the mountains, where everything she'd learned about precision shooting under pressure would determine whether innocent people lived or died. The transformation from museum girl to mission specialist was complete. Now came the hardest part, proving trust had been placed correctly.
72 hours later, Carmen Vega stepped off the transport helicopter at Camp Thunder Ridge, carrying the same worn canvas bag she'd arrived with weeks earlier. But everything else had changed. The mission had been a complete success. The high-value target neutralized with a single precision shot at 1,247 meters. The diplomatic hostages rescued unharmed, and no casualties among the operational team. The shot itself had required everything Carmen had learned about precision marksmanship under extreme conditions. Altitude effects, complex wind patterns, temperature gradients, and the psychological pressure of knowing that innocent lives hung in the balance. The Barrett 50 had performed flawlessly, but only because Carmen had understood exactly how to use it as the precision instrument it was designed to be. Colonel Pike was waiting on the landing pad with Captain Walsh and Lieutenant Colonel Morrison. Their expressions carried the satisfaction of a successful operation, but more importantly, they showed the professional respect reserved for someone who had proven themselves under the most demanding conditions possible. "Outstanding work, Ms. Vega," Morrison said, as Carmen approached. "The mission couldn't have gone better. Your shot placement was perfect, your tactical decision-making was flawless, and your coordination with the support team was exceptional."
Carmen accepted the praise with the same quiet professionalism she'd maintained throughout her time at Camp Thunder Ridge. Success in high-stakes operations wasn't about personal recognition. It was about accomplishing the mission and bringing everyone home safe. Thank you, sir. The support team performed exceptionally. Staff Sergeant Webb's spotting was perfect, and Corporal Hayes' maintained flawless communications throughout the operation. Pike nodded approvingly. Carmen's immediate deflection of credit to her team members demonstrated the kind of leadership mentality that made the difference between good soldiers and exceptional ones. Technical skills could be taught, but the mindset that prioritized mission success over personal recognition was far rarer. As Carmen walked across the facility toward the contractor quarters, she noticed the dramatic change in atmosphere. Conversations stopped as she passed, but not with the hostile amusement she'd grown accustomed to. Instead, she saw genuine respect and curiosity from contractors who were beginning to understand that their assumptions about combat effectiveness had been fundamentally flawed. Trevor Nash was waiting outside the contractor quarters, and his body language suggested he'd been there for some time. His usual entourage of supporters was absent, replaced by the kind of solitary reflection that comes from having core beliefs challenged by undeniable evidence. "Trevor," said Carmen as she approached. "I heard the mission was successful. Congratulations." Carmen stopped to study his expression, looking for signs of the resentment or dismissal that might be expected from someone whose professional identity had been threatened by her success. Instead, she saw something she hadn't expected: genuine humility and what appeared to be a desire to learn. "Thank you, Trevor. The mission went well because everyone involved understood their role and executed professionally." Trevor nodded slowly. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened during the evaluation, and about some of the things you said about competitive shooting versus tactical shooting. I think I need to understand the differences better." It was the kind of admission that required genuine courage. Trevor's entire professional identity at Camp Thunder Ridge had been built on his competitive shooting achievements and his technical knowledge with precision weapons. Acknowledging that those qualifications might be inadequate for real-world missions meant questioning everything he assumed about his own capabilities. Carmen set down her equipment bag and gave Trevor her full attention. "Trevor, your shooting skills are exceptional. Your technical knowledge is extensive, and your equipment expertise is valuable. The issue isn't that those things don't matter, it's that they're not sufficient by themselves for tactical applications."
She gestured toward the range area where the Barrett evaluation had taken place. Competitive shooting teaches you to perform consistently under predictable conditions with known variables. Tactical shooting requires adaptability when everything is unknown and the consequences are life and death. Trevor absorbed this explanation, clearly processing the implications for his own development as a marksman. So, how does someone bridge that gap? How do you develop tactical judgment when civilian contractors don't have access to combat deployments? It was an astute question that got to the heart of the training challenges faced by contractors and civilian marksmen who wanted to develop real-world capabilities. Carmen considered her response carefully, recognizing that Trevor was asking for genuine guidance rather than trying to challenge her approach. Start with understanding that the weapon system is just a tool. The real skill is in reading environments, assessing risks, and making decisions under pressure. You can develop those capabilities through scenario-based training that emphasizes judgment over speed. Master Sergeant Kim approached the group carrying a clipboard and wearing an expression that suggested significant reflection about his role in the facility's training methodology. "Ms. Vega, when you're ready, I'd like to discuss some changes we're implementing to our contractor evaluation process." Carmen followed Kim to his office, where she found a complete overhaul of the facility's assessment protocols spread across his desk. The new procedures emphasized environmental awareness, tactical decision-making, and performance under stress, rather than the speed-focused metrics that had dominated the previous system. These changes are based on your recommendations and what we observed during your evaluation. We're implementing scenario-based assessments that test judgment as well as marksmanship, and we're bringing in instructors with combat experience to help develop tactical thinking. Carmen reviewed the proposed changes, noting the comprehensive nature of the overhaul. This wasn't a minor adjustment to existing procedures. It was a fundamental reimagining of how precision marksmanship should be taught and evaluated. This looks comprehensive, Sergeant Major, but implementing these changes will require more than just new procedures. You'll need to change the culture that prioritizes range performance over tactical effectiveness. Kim nodded grimly. That's the hard part. Some of the contractors are resistant to the idea that their competition achievements don't automatically qualify them for tactical missions. There's been pushback against the new evaluation criteria. Carmen wasn't surprised. Institutional change was always difficult, especially when it challenged the professional identity and status of established personnel. The contractors who had built their reputations on competitive shooting achievements would naturally resist standards that diminish the value of those accomplishments. Change is difficult, Carmen acknowledged, but the alternative is continuing to graduate contractors who can't perform when it matters most. The mission I just completed required capabilities that your previous evaluation system wouldn't have identified.
As word of the successful mission spread throughout Camp Thunder Ridge, Carmen found herself in an unusual position. Contractors who had dismissed her as inadequate were now seeking her guidance. Instructors who had questioned her qualifications were asking for her input on curriculum development. The facility that had treated her as a second-class participant was now recognizing her as a subject matter expert. Riley Park approached her during the evening meal, carrying a notebook filled with questions about tactical shooting methodology. "Carmen, I've been thinking about what you said about the differences between range performance and combat effectiveness. Could you help me understand how to develop better environmental awareness?" The question represented a significant shift in Riley's approach. Instead of focusing on equipment upgrades or technical modifications, he was asking about the cognitive skills that separated good marksmen from exceptional ones. Carmen spent the next hour walking Riley through the mental processes she used to assess shooting conditions, read environmental variables, and make tactical decisions under pressure. It was the kind of knowledge transfer that couldn't happen through formal instruction. It required mentorship between professionals who understood the stakes involved. Later that evening, Colonel Pike found Carmen on the range where she was conducting an impromptu seminar for a group of contractors who wanted to understand her approach to precision shooting. The informal class had grown from Trevor's initial questions to include nearly half the facility's contractor staff. "Miss Vega," Pike said, as the group dispersed, "I wanted to discuss your future plans. Your performance on this mission was exceptional, and there are additional opportunities for someone with your capabilities." Carmen had been expecting this conversation. Successful completion of high-stakes missions inevitably led to offers for additional deployments, consulting contracts, or permanent positions with special operations units. The transition from dismissed contractor to sought-after specialist had been dramatic and comprehensive. "Sir, I appreciate the recognition, but I think my most valuable contribution might be here at Camp Thunder Ridge. The changes they're implementing to their training methodology could have significant impact on contractor preparation for real-world missions." Pike studied her thoughtfully. "You're talking about staying to help reform their training program rather than taking more lucrative deployment opportunities." "Yes, sir. Individual missions matter, but systemic change in how we prepare people for tactical shooting could prevent failures across multiple operations." It was a response that demonstrated the kind of long-term thinking that separated tactical professionals from technical specialists. Carmen understood that her greatest contribution wouldn't be as an individual shooter, but as someone who could help develop better shooters for future missions. Pike nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the kind of institutional perspective we need more of. If you're serious about staying to help reform their program, I can arrange for official support and resources." As Carmen walked back to her quarters that evening, she reflected on the remarkable transformation that had occurred over the past few weeks. The woman they'd called Museum Girl had become the catalyst for comprehensive reform of precision marksmanship training. Her quiet persistence in the face of dismissal had culminated not just in personal vindication, but in institutional change that could improve tactical effectiveness for years to come.
The real victory wasn't the successful mission or the recognition of her capabilities. It was the opportunity to ensure that future marksmen would be better prepared for the moments when everything depended on taking the right shot rather than the fast shot.
6 months later, Carmen Vega stood at the same firing line where her journey at Camp Thunder Ridge had begun, but everything about the facility had been transformed. The range that had once echoed with the rapid-fire demonstrations of contractors trying to impress each other now hosted methodical, deliberate training sessions focused on precision under pressure rather than speed under artificial constraints. The new evaluation protocol Carmen had helped design was in full effect. Contractors now faced scenarios that tested environmental awareness, tactical decision-making, and the ability to perform when stakes were genuinely high. The change hadn't been easy. Several contractors had washed out when they couldn't adapt to standards that prioritized judgment over raw technical skill, but the results spoke for themselves. Trevor Nash approached Carmen's observation post, carrying the worn notebook that had become his constant companion over the past months. His transformation had been as dramatic as the facilities. The cocky, competitive shooter had evolved into a thoughtful, tactical marksman who understood the difference between looking good on paper and performing when lives hung in the balance. "Carmen, I wanted you to see this," Trevor said, opening his notebook to pages filled with environmental data, tactical observations, and shooting scenarios. "I've been working through the exercises you recommended, focusing on situational awareness rather than just marksmanship mechanics." Carmen reviewed Trevor's notes, seeing the evidence of genuine learning and development. His approach to precision shooting had evolved from the mechanical application of technical skills to the adaptive thinking necessary for tactical effectiveness. More importantly, his attitude had shifted from competitive ego to professional competence. "This is solid work, Trevor. Your scenario analysis shows real understanding of how environmental factors interact with tactical requirements. How do you feel about your progress?" Trevor considered the question carefully. "Honestly, I feel like I'm finally learning to shoot, rather than just hitting targets. The competitive shooting background gave me technical skills, but it didn't teach me how to think like a marksman. Understanding when not to shoot has been as important as learning how to shoot accurately." The comment reflected a fundamental shift in thinking that went beyond individual development. Trevor's journey from competitive shooter to tactical marksman embodied the broader transformation that had occurred at Camp Thunder Ridge, a recognition that precision shooting was as much about cognitive skills as physical ones. Master Sergeant Kim joined the conversation, carrying evaluation reports from the facility's latest contractor assessment cycle. His expression showed the satisfaction of someone who had seen his professional methods vindicated by improved results. "Carmen, the new evaluation protocols are working better than we hoped," Kim reported. "Contractors are developing tactical thinking alongside marksmanship skills, and their performance on real-world missions has improved dramatically. We've had 3 successful deployments in the past month, all involving precision shooting under challenging conditions." The success metrics were gratifying, but Carmen knew the real measure of institutional change would be long-term consistency. Transforming organizational culture required more than new procedures. It demanded sustained commitment to different priorities and values. Riley Park appeared at the group, now serving as one of the facility's senior instructors under the Reform Training Program. His own development had been remarkable. The contractor who had once remained silent while Carmen faced harassment had become one of the most effective advocates for the new tactical methodology.
"Carmen, I wanted to update you on the mentorship program we discussed," Riley said. "We've paired experienced tactical shooters with contractors who have strong technical backgrounds but limited field experience. The knowledge transfer has been exceptional." The mentorship program had been Carmen's idea, a structured way to pass tactical wisdom from combat veterans to technically skilled civilians. It addressed one of the fundamental challenges in contractor development, bridging the gap between theoretical knowledge and practical application. Colonel Pike's voice came from behind them. "Ms. Vega, do you have a moment? I'd like to discuss the broader implications of what you've accomplished here." Carmen followed Pike to the facility's conference room, where she found a comprehensive analysis of how the reformed training methodology was affecting contractor performance across multiple military installations. The data was impressive. Improved mission success rates, reduced casualties, and better tactical decision-making among graduates of programs that had adopted Carmen's approach. Your work here has become a model for precision marksmanship training throughout the special operations community, Pike explained. We're implementing similar reforms at facilities across 3 service branches, and the initial results are consistently positive. Carmen studied the reports, seeing evidence that her influence was extending far beyond Camp Thunder Ridge. The principles she'd advocated, prioritizing judgment over speed, emphasizing environmental awareness, and testing performance under genuine pressure, were becoming standard elements of tactical marksmanship training. Sir, this is gratifying to see, but sustainable change requires more than just procedural modifications. It requires cultural transformation that values the right kind of performance over the impressive kind of performance. Pike nodded approvingly. That's exactly why I wanted to discuss your next assignment. We're establishing a new training doctrine development position that would put you at the center of marksmanship reform efforts across multiple installations. Interested? The offer represented the culmination of Carmen's unlikely journey from dismissed contractor to institutional reformer. But as Carmen considered Pike's proposal, she found herself thinking about the individual contractors at Camp Thunder Ridge who were still developing their tactical capabilities. Colonel, I appreciate the recognition, but I think my most valuable contribution is still happening here. The cultural transformation we've started requires consistent presence and mentorship. Building better marksmen is a long-term process that can't be reduced to policy changes. Pike studied her thoughtfully. You're choosing to stay with hands-on instruction rather than taking a position that would give you broader institutional influence. Yes, sir. Individual development creates institutional change, not the other way around. Every contractor who learns to think tactically becomes a multiplier for the principles we're teaching. As evening approached, Carmen found herself back on the range where her transformation had begun. The facility was quiet now, but she could see contractors in the distance conducting individual practice sessions focused on environmental reading and tactical decision-making rather than rapid-fire demonstrations. Trevor Nash approached her one final time, his expression serious and thoughtful. Carmen, I wanted to thank you for something specific. You could have used your success to humiliate the people who treated you badly when you first arrived. Instead, you chose to help us become better. That says something important about your character. Carmen considered Trevor's observation. It was true that she could have used her vindication as a weapon against those who had dismissed and harassed her, but institutional change required building bridges rather than burning them, and personal revenge would have undermined the broader mission of improving tactical effectiveness. Trevor, holding grudges doesn't improve marksmanship or save lives. The goal was never to prove I was better than anyone else. It was to prove that better methods existed and could be learned by anyone willing to put in the work. As Carmen prepared to leave the range, she reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought her to this point. 6 months ago, she'd been museum girl, the washed-out contractor with the antique rifle who couldn't meet the facility's speed requirements. Tonight, she was the architect of a reformed training methodology that was improving tactical effectiveness across multiple military branches. But more than personal vindication, Carmen felt satisfaction in knowing that future marksmen would be better prepared for the moments when precision mattered most. The contractors now graduating from Camp Thunder Ridge understood that tactical shooting wasn't about impressing observers or winning competitions. It was about making the right decision at the right moment, when everything depended on getting it right. The transformation had been complete and permanent. The facility that had once valued speed over accuracy, equipment over judgment, and competition scores over combat effectiveness now produced marksmen who could perform when lives hung in the balance. Carmen packed her equipment bag and headed toward the parking lot, where her rusted Honda Civic waited to take her home.
Tomorrow would bring new contractors to train, new scenarios to develop, and new opportunities to pass along the hard-won wisdom that came from understanding the difference between shooting fast and shooting right. The woman they'd called Museum Girl had become something far more valuable, a teacher who understood that the most important shots weren't the ones that impressed observers, but the ones that brought everyone home safe. Her quiet revolution had transformed not just one facility, but an entire approach to precision marksmanship that would influence military training for years to come. Sometimes the most profound changes began with the simplest truths, that being right mattered more than being fast, that judgment trumped speed, and that the person everyone overlooked might just be the person everyone needed. Carmen Vega had proven that when it mattered most, precision would always defeat haste, wisdom would overcome arrogance, and quiet competence would triumph over loud mediocrity. Her legacy wasn't written in competition scores or performance records. It was measured in lives saved by marksmen who had learned to take the shot that counted rather than the shot that impressed. The range would remember her long after she was gone, but more importantly, every precision shot taken by graduates of her program would carry forward the understanding that true marksmanship was about much more than hitting targets. It was about making the right choice when everything depended on being absolutely, perfectly right. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.